members. Thank you again for your service, and welcome to our guests, and a special welcome to Investigator Chris Millicetz, who is joining us today after a few weeks of illness, and we're very happy to see him here and doing well. Sounds like we have a musical soundtrack.
NFL.
Oh, NFL.
NFL and Fox.
This has become a contact sport. We are convening under the provisions of the Open Meetings Law, a copy of which is posted by the door to this room. And I'm not sure we have anybody here that hasn't been here before, but let's just go around the table and introduce ourselves briefly.
Gina Simpson.
Kyle Cole Morgan.
Richard Evening.
Trent Fellers.
Lincoln Zare.
Don Hers. Marvin.
All right, first order of business is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Move approval.
Second.
Is there any discussion about the minutes? We have a seconded motion to approve them. Molly, will you call the roll?
Dan Marvin,
Yes.
Don Hers.
Yes.
Lincoln Zare,
Yes.
Trent Fowlers,
Yes.
Richard Evans.
Yes.
Kyle Morgan.
Yeah.
Gina Simpson.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Motion passes. We'll begin the substance of our meeting today with a presentation by John Kripe, who's the president of John E. Kripe and Associates. Thank you very much for coming today. He appears at the request of the Lincoln Police Union.
That's good.
And has information to share with us, and we expect his presentation will run approximately 45 minutes. He'll take questions, but he can tell you his preference for how he takes them. And Mr. Kripe, welcome, and please begin.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is John Kripe. I'm a human resources consultant. I have clients from the city of Omaha to Scotts Bluff to down to the corner of McCook up to Norfolk. I represent cities, counties, state of Nebraska, community colleges, state college system, and NRAs, NPPD. So I'm a certified or recognized expert at the Commission of Industrial Relations. I've testified at the Commission as an expert for the last 23, 24 years on a number of cases, including cases involving pensions, including this particular pension. I have a long history with the City of Lincoln. I started employment in 1971 with the Lincoln Police Department, and I retired in 2011 in the Human Resources Department. I had a small glitch in my employment on behalf of the United States Navy at their request at the end of the Vietnam War. So otherwise, I had 40 years of service with the City of Lincoln. The first 17 years of which were as a Lincoln police officer, investigator, union member, and took part in and was active with the pension. First thing I learned was that if you weren't here the first 3 years and you didn't stay past your first 3 years of employment, you forfeited your contributions and interest. And somewhere in the early 1970s, there was a lawsuit, and that was rectified. And so once people left, they were able to get their contributions and interest. In the late 1970s, early 80s, there was a lawsuit regarding the Hill Ideen controversy. That was a case involving whether or not the city should, based on the definition of regular pay, whether they should be taking contributions from the employees on overtime and paying an overtime benefit to employees, to Lincoln police officers. Filed a lawsuit, went to the Nebraska Supreme Court. They ruled in the police officer's favor, and in turn diminished the value of the pension in terms of what an employee would receive, since the income would go down from 7. So during those periods in the pension history, the statute or the governing language was at the state of Nebraska at the unicameral. So the pension was as part of the state statute, and it wasn't easily changed. But over the course of the next couple of years, it was changed, and they added what is now called Plan B, 7.6% contribution. and kept Plan, what is now called Plan C, the 7% contribution. And some of us made wise decisions and others didn't make wise decisions when we were able to elect to choose which plan we belonged in. If you wanted to stay with the 7% plan, you received the overtime back from the plan that you had been withheld from you. In my case, that was roughly $800. And if you went to the 7-6 plan, that money stayed in the pension and you were in the new plan. And so there are a number of us who unwisely picked to take our $800 and run. And years later, our pension would have been considerably less than they would have been had we made the right choice. Somewhere in the late 80s, the Lincoln Police Union, along with the Fire Union, were working with state senators to see if there was a method where we could take the pension out of the state statute and move it back into the city ordinance so that we could clean up language-related issues and issues that came up on a local level without having to go to the legislature every time we needed a change. And so at the end of the 1980s, the bill was passed allowing us to move it to the city ordinance, and it was moved exactly word for word from the statute to the city. And that was in the beginning, I think, of the Harris administration, if I remember right. And shortly thereafter, either I'd moved from the police department over to the Human Resources Department in 1988. In about 89 or 90, I was assigned as the Police and Fire Pension Administrator, and I kept that role till I retired in 2011. So from roughly 1990 to 2011, I was the administrator of the pension. It may sound a little more glamorous than it actually is. An administrator for this pension at that time really didn't have much of an action other than we would produce the benefit, we would do the calculations, send the calculations to the actuary. The actuary would determine what the pension was going to be for the employee, and then we'd go through the process of helping the employee to retire. Investments were not, were handled sort of under the table, over the table, if you would say. The first meeting I went to in 1990 for investments, there were a couple local banks and a couple local insurance companies, and they had quite an argument at the first meeting on which location was going to get the purchase of the bond and whether the bond should be purchased at a premium or not. At the end of the meeting, one of them decided that it was their turn, and everybody agreed, and they made the recommendation. That was the last time that committee met. Mr. Lutomsky and I got together and decided we would do a bid process the next time we had a bid or a bond that we needed to purchase. Created the bond that we wanted to purchase, and then the first time that we actually did a bid, we saved $40,000 on the purchase of the bond over the working group that had for decades made the decision on what the city was to purchase. And that kind of led us down the path of more involvement with regard to both administration and investments. In the course of action during the about 1992, there was some long-term discussions with then Mayor Johans about the possibility of having a COLA attached to the pension. We were the only ones within our geographic region that didn't have a cost of living adjustment already as part of the pension. We weren't talking about medical. Many of the pensions that are in this region are also have 100% paid medical, and they're also part of their pension systems. We were not talking about that. We were talking about a COLA. The COLA price at that point was roughly somewhere in the $30 to $40 million range. We had no money to purchase COLA, but there was considerable pressure to at least up the pensions on people who were already drawing. We had people in the pension system who had or are survivor beneficiaries who were drawing $300 or $400 of full pension from when their spouses had worked at the police department a decade or so before.
Is that monthly or annual?
That's monthly. They were at the minimum. And many of them were barely making it. So in our discussions with Mayor Johans, we talked about doing a 0.5% increase to every existing pensioner's pension based on the number of years that each one of them had service. So if you had been in the pension for 40 years, you would have got a 20% increase on your pension, and in some respects almost doubled their pensions. And at the same time, we discussed the alternatives to what would become the 13th check. During that period of discussions, Mayor Johans said that if I could come up with a way to do a cost of living adjustment that didn't cost $30 million, I would be a saint. I'm not quite sure he realized what sainthood would cost, but I worked with Ken Albers at Gabriel Roeder Smith and Company, who is our actuary, and they had been our actuary for a couple of decades. They had suggested that we work on what is now called a 13th check. We formulated the process for the 13th check, and in September of 1992, we entered the very first 13th check in the amount of $600, with some language that would be adjusted based on the CPIU. Only the $600 adjustment, not your pension. And then we developed, mostly through discussions between myself and Mr. Lutomsky, who is a relative genius and a great credit to the city of Lincoln, developed the system in the format that would create the formula that would fund the pension. The long-term thought, at least in my mind, was that if we could, over a long period of time, develop enough money, we could actually purchase the COLA that we were trying to work on in the early 90s, and that we would have sufficient funds in that pot to actually make the cash transaction. The goal was first to assist those people with a very small cost of living increase, since once you leave the city, your pension is frozen at whatever rate you're in, and the only adjustment you get is that small 13th check and its associated CPI. And so whether you are on retirement 20 years or 30 years, your pension's relatively fixed on where it was to start with. And over the course of the years, funding continued to grow, and in 1994, we increased or requested an increase from the mayor's office to go to $750 for the COLA, and that was a slight jump over the CPI, so it got to from $600 to $750, and that started September 1st, 1994. Still provided pretty good benefit. The plan itself is growing. The funding of the plan, the overall plan was very strong. There was no need to be concerned about where we were and what we needed to do. We had recognized in about 1994 that there are a number of factors that were going to be approaching the stabilization of the plan. We had a lot of people that were going to be headed toward baby boomer age. We had a lot of people who were going to be retiring. Our system was in such a position where if you were in plan B or C and you chose to leave, you could take out your contributions and interest and you'd get a reduced annuity. You still can today. And in addition, you only contributed for 21 years. So you will see in the plan that was in part of the legislative language, not the language that was brought over from the state. So you would see people who would leave with lump sum contribution, reducing their pension roughly in half. And I had one instance where I sat in a corner office, and for this building here was a parking lot. I had a retiring firefighter come to my office to retire and pointed out the window and pointed to what he said was a collector's Thunderbird, and he had just bought it with his pension money, and it was parked between two dump trucks here in this parking lot. Certainly not a very good use of your retirement funds. And so, given those kind of scenarios where people were taking their money and misusing it towards other factors, we talked about creating a plan where we could be more stable in terms of when somebody would leave. And so we developed Plan A. Plan A has the same pension payout as Plan 7, or the 7% Plan C, at the maximum of 64%. Now, there's a little give and take in there in that you contribute for 21 years, you stop, and then when you reach 53, you contribute the other years to get your additional 10%, but the gross payout, maximum 64%. Plan B payout is 68%. So we decided that we would create, following what the general market condition calls a rule of 75, that you had to be age 50 and 25 years of service to be eligible, and that you would never cease your contributions to the pension, that your 8% contribution would always go. There wouldn't be a lag, so even if you reached 25 years, you would continue to make contributions. And I know of a number of employees who have done that, who didn't wish to go at the time, and they continued to make contributions, which would have been in excess of what was necessary to fund their pension. So we put that pension in place in about 1994, and all new hires were going to be on Plan A. In 1996, we approached Mayor Johans and asked him if we could invest in equities. Prior to 1996, we had no investments in the equity market. Everything was in the bond market. Our rate of return was dramatically low, as you might have expected, unlike the 90s or 80s, where things were really going well and the inflation was high. Bonds started to trickle off, and so we asked if we could make investments in the equities market. The first year we made an investment, it was we were allowed to make 5% of our portfolio into an equities investment. And so we made the equity investment of 5%, and the second year we went back and asked for additional amount to go in, and we were told we couldn't go any further than the 5%, but we were allowed to keep the 2% that we made above. And so now we were at 7% of our portfolio was into equities. And that stayed that way. It stayed that way until the Wesley administration. In 2000, we developed a drop plan for the controlling of the when people would leave. If you're recognizing that employees are going to leave in bunches, then we could plan out Plan A members only, not Plan B or C, Plan A only. We could measure when we thought those people would be separating from service, give both the fire and police department a chance to understand when command structure would change, when employees or when the need for promotions, they'd have a chance to at least manage their staffing and their recruiting so that they could fill those spots as time went along. And so as part of the drop plan, there was a 1-year short-term catch-up, because the difference between what we had funded and the perspective of an earlier retirement at age 50 left a small gap of a couple $100,000. After that was resolved, then the drop plan took effect and was extremely successful both then and according to the actuary's report, still is successful. Still has a number of people on the drop, and so if you enter the drop, your pension is frozen as of that date. It does not increase. If your wages go up, your pension does not go up. It is paid into a trust, and so it is part of the pension, because as a part of the pension, if you are disabled or killed in the line of duty, your spouse has the right to choose between the drop system or the pension that he or she would have earned up to the date of their disability or death. And that has happened a couple of times. It is rare, but it has happened. In the late 2000s, there was a similar committee, or in the middle 2000s, late 2000s, there was a similar committee to this one. The members were tasked with looking at the overall operation of the pension itself and its administration and investments and any changes. There was pressure by the employee groups to raise benefits and including a COLA. So we went through the exercise all over again to look at what a 3% COLA would be, what a 1% COLA, and even to a 1.5 half, so that we could look at whether or not you could factor in a COLA in sequential amounts over a number of years. The actuary told us that if we were going to do it in a sequential way, and even if we wrote it in the ordinance, they would calculate it as if it happened today. That there's no such thing as a sequential move. If you wanted to make a change and you write it in the ordinance, that change is solid. So you'll note that the 13th check language says that it'll be paid if funds are available. So in essence, it's not a guarantee, although it has plenty of money. But if we had guaranteed the payment, then it would have been treated as a COLA and created an unfunded liability. And of course, it isn't an unfunded liability. It is a pay-as-you-go system. And so during that period, we discussed, and on the committee, there was an actuary from Omaha who was independent of the city and independent of the city's actuary. There were civilian members of the committee. There were representatives from the mayor's office. There were representatives from the police and fire unions. We were the resources to that committee. And as a result, we discussed with that committee the process of what we should do in order to stabilize the plan. And the discussion was that we would ask the mayor for language relating to the mandatory payment of normal cost, and that if we could make normal cost payments, that the plan would eventually straighten itself out. Now, the problem with that was, even though we were in the middle 2000s, maybe a little later than that, since I don't have the documents, it's a little harder for me to tell what year it was. It took several years for us to get the ordinance in place, and then there was a lag time based on the ordinance, so the ordinance didn't take effect until August of 31st of 2012. And since August 2012, the language has been there and the city has paid normal cost. I have a chart here that I'd like to have handed out. And this is data that came to us from the city, and I think the chair probably has the same data and probably shared it with you all, so it's not really a secret. If you will look across the red lines, the left, of course, the left column is 0 to 25%. The bottom column are the years 1990 to 2015. The red line is the employer normal cost, relatively stable. The number ran from a low of 10.72% in the last 26 years to the maximum 14.23, and this is the employer's portion normal cost. And the 1423 is the most current, with an increase this last year of roughly 1% or 1.5%. Otherwise, for the last 26 years, the normal cost has been relatively steady. The blue line is the employee contributions. And so you can see by the early times, the contributions in 1990 was 7.43, and it dipped to the 4.33 number because that's when we were making the switches to give the employees back their pre-21 money, and that caused their actual contributions to go lower. And so then their contributions stabilized in the mid-90s to around 6 plus, and went up to 7.77, and then the actuary decided that they should change the method they were using to to count for the employee portion, and it went down again to 6.86, and at the end of this year it was 6.88, and the average, the actual contribution for the employer is the yellow line. Less than, in 1990, 3.71%. It dipped down to 2.06%, and then has risen to 18.98, with 2014 being 20%. The black line was is the recommended contribution rate. Now, I can tell you that the average employee over that 25 period was 6.68%. The normal cost was 11.86, and the employer actual was 8.02%, 3.84% less than the normal cost on an every year average for those 26-year period. There were 6 years where the actual contribution was greater than the normal cost out of those 26. Those were 2007, 2008, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Of course, 12 and beyond is where the mandatory normal cost contribution came into effect. The recommended was 9.08, so even the recommended number wasn't followed. But given a little history, the actuary in the mid-90s, when the plan was more than 100% funded, had recommended that the city put in 0. We were on the pace of 121 to 118% funded on a consistent basis. We were in very good shape financially. We didn't have any shortfalls. Matter of fact, we had excesses for a number of years in a row. The actuary said we should put in 0, and I'm sure on your chart you will find that as well. And our contributions, recommended contributions, went from 1.4 million down to 0. I had long conversations with several mayors over the history, and the conclusion is that once you don't put in the sufficient amount, based on the statute language that you're able to tax specific to fund the pension. Now, the only drawback there is that the pension's under the same lid everybody else is. So in order to fund the pension, if you don't put your 1.4 million in, the next year, that 1.4 million goes somewhere else. Yeah, it goes to the street department, it goes to the parks department, it goes to the libraries, it goes somewhere, but it doesn't go to the pension. So if you do that for a couple of years and you've compounded your lack of contributions, you will continue to be short. Even if your returns are better than normal, you're going to continue to be behind. And that, I saw the chart, some other speaker showed you pretty straightforward presentation on that the tax is relatively flat. Doesn't surprise me at all. We haven't really been in a position to do what they are currently doing for a number of years. There was always a thought that if we didn't raise taxes, we could shift it. But what you do in shifting is that the normal cost and I'll read it to you because my memory's not that good. Normal cost is described by the actuary as the portion of actuarial present value of future benefits that is assigned to the current year by the actuarial cost method. It's sometimes referred to the current service cost. So if we're thinking about paying for police and police retirement in the 1990s and we don't pay for it, that shifts the burden to the 2000s. And if we don't pay for the burden that we had in the 2000s, it shifts us to the teens. And so what you have is a movement of the responsibility. So the people who are getting the service, taxpayers who got the service in 1990, aren't paying the bill. The people who are now paying the bill are the people who didn't get the service in 1990, or at least the majority of them. So the long-term funding is how we got to where we are. As early as, or you can call it as late as, 2008, this plan was 100% funded. So it hasn't been a long history where this plan has not been funded despite the contributions on the part of the city. If you look at greater detail, the employee contributions over that 26-year period was $47.9 million. I'm going to round the numbers because you probably have the same chart. So 47.9 million is what the employees contributed for the 26-year period. The employer contributed 65.3 million for the same period. Normal cost was 82.9 million, a difference of 17.6 million that the city did not put in over that same period. Now, you can, I'm not smart enough, I'm sure there are people smart enough to figure out the value of what that would have been during our years of interest, but it's considerably greater than the 17.6 million if it earned the interest rate we earned during that period. And so I would suggest that it's a sum quite larger than 17.6. If you look at what the pension is intended to do, the pension is both a disability plan and a income stream. It's intended to take care of the employee and their family in case of disability or death. Two of my coworkers, when I was a young police officer, died as a result of illnesses and or injuries. Both of them were, after their death, declared duty-related disabilities, and to this date, their family received compensation for those many decades to help offset what they would have had. It is something that is put in place to protect them. A defined contribution doesn't do that. You don't buy insurance for that, or you can buy life insurance, but that really doesn't do your income. So this plan is more than a pension. It is a family plan, to put it nicely. In addition, these employees don't get Social Security, don't get Social Security at all. They have the medical portion of Social Security, but they don't get Social Security. And so even if they have outside employment, and many of them do, both police and fire, work outside jobs to add income to their families, they're not able to get Social Security at full value. There is a windfall protection that would reduce the Social Security of a police officer who worked part-time by at least 40%. So even if they work a second job unrelated to the city of Lincoln, they can't draw full Social Security. If this was a civilian plan, if this plan was a Social Security plan and a civilian plan for those same 26 years, the city of Lincoln would have contributed $122 million to their pension and Social Security. Not the $65 million they contributed, it would have been $122.9 million. So this isn't an issue of where gosh, it's the employee's fault they have such a lucrative plan, because they don't. This barely replaces what Social Security will give them. And, as I said before, they're going to be short on Social Security.
Can you explain that in greater detail, how you arrive at that?
Yeah, it's Social Security is 6.2% on the same base salary for the 26 years. They already get the 1 point whatever it is for medical, so I didn't count that. So I only used the 6.2 on the same base rate of pay for this bargaining unit. So I took the base salaries for the 26 years, multiplied them. And then the civilian plan for the city of Lincoln was 12% city and contribution until about 4 or 5 years ago. Changed to 9%, I believe, and I calculated the 12 up to when it changed to 9, and I used the 9 after that.
In a DC plan?
Right, excuse me?
In a DC?
In a DC, in the city's civilian DC plan. And so that's the calculation, the two of those added together on the civilians, if this was a civilian group, civilian plan with the same constraints, would have been 122 million, almost 123 million. Roughly
$40 million over.
57 million over what they did pay. No interest involved, just raw numbers, so, as a rolling
How
number.
did you get to the 17.6 million? Because, I mean, we're looking at, you know, the chart that we all had, it was from 1990 to 14 or 15.
You had
It was about a $7 million difference between,
that, and that's easy to explain. That's a recommended employer contribution.
so that does not,
That's
that does
not-
not include the unfunded liability.
No, and that's
So-
not normal cost.
Right,
All I did was normal cost. I didn't do the recommendation or the recommended actuarial contribution. I did the normal cost. Because I'm trying to show the difference between what would be current service and what the citizens should have been paying for versus not the recommendation of the actuary, because once you got to 120, the actuary says, well, there's no need to put any more money, you're already at 100%. And the goal is, pardon me, by the actuaries, to stay at 100. Well, that doesn't give you any cushion for 2001, doesn't give you any cushion for 2008. So if you're always running at 100 or 101 or 102, if you have any funding issues related to revenue, you're going to be under. And the further the problems become, the further under you go. So instead of, and there's a theory, and it's a pretty common theory. It's used both in private sector and public sector. If you get to a certain overage, you're allowed to use that overage as part of your funding. And that's acceptable. I'm not saying it's not acceptable. The only problem is that if you're a tax base and you're going to try to tax for the money 1 year and the next year you're not going to tax, you can't find that money. And if the next year you can't find it again, and then pretty soon it's almost impossible and you put yourself into a corner.
But the ARC, the recommended contribution, is a combination of normal and unfunded, right?
It is now. There was a long period of time where we really didn't have any unfunded. I mean, you can only see that that's a portion of,
95, I think, was.
Right.
So what you're saying is that in the 90s, the ARC was not normal cost, it was less than normal.
the
But
arc,
city-
the arc
city
was
of
greater,
Sumner contributed more than the ARC.
more than the recommended. That's
more
correct.
than the recommended,
yeah.
because they recognized that they'd get into this budget bind.
Right, we continued to, over the course of my history and Mr. Lutomsky's history, every year we'd send a letter asking for normal cost. And every year the budget would be something different than normal cost. It's not up to us. We make the request and I don't juggle the budget. So however we got the funds. The next year we'd look at it and we'd make another request. It was only after we were able to get the language that says, and this is copied after the state of Nebraska. State of Nebraska has always had a statute that says you have to put in the cost. And so every year they're not underfunded in the state patrol pension.
And that came in 12, you said?
Yeah, August 31st, 2012 was the very first time.
But it was voted on in 67.
So
It was voted on a few years ahead of that. I can't tell you when, Dan. When I looked at the ordinance and it says when it was enacted, it just gave me the date and then it says effective 2012. And so I can't tell you the date. Law department probably can, but it was somewhere in, but it was a 3 or 4 year lag. In order to build up the funds.
So John, help me understand if that statute or whatever was in place. In 2014, we presented an excess, that was an excess, wasn't it? 2013, we paid less, paid $271,000 less.
Right.
But you're paying,
How is that possible?
you're paying normal cost, you're not paying
It's
ARC.
the
Unfunded
it's the
liability.
advertising of the
Yeah.
That we
unfunded
have no
liability.
obligation.
No.
There's no component anywhere
Right.
that mandates that.
Right.
That's correct. What our intent was, Lincoln, was to get into a position where we would at least get the cost of service.
Right.
That you weren't getting outside. I mean, we weren't trying to affect some big change in terms of UAL. And a matter of fact, when I retired, UAL was 39 million. It wasn't 100 and whatever.
John, were you asking for the actually required contribution or the normal costs in those prior? Do you remember?
I can't remember whether, I think early on it was the recommendation. But then it became after the discussion, the normal cost. Because at least in theory, we thought if we could get the regular cost of service, that you could get some stabilization. Now, that's outside of your investments and outside of whatever else might happen in the world, but, you know, if you're actually paying for the work that occurs on an ongoing service basis, then you really have captured the cost of what it is to do the pension.
Maybe this isn't the kind of place to talk about it, but there was a 2008 vote to put a COLA in there, and you were with the city in 2008 to implement like a 1.5% COLA in the plan.
Well, that's the period where we tried to get an adjustment. We had gone through a number of iterations on trying to get something passed.
But it went to council for a vote.
Right.
We had all that.
Yeah. And it,
Can you give a thumbnail of the details of what that
well, we had looked
provided?
at what would have been a 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%, up to 3%. We thought that we had enough money in the plan that would have, in the 13th check, that would have paid for roughly 1.5% with a small adjustment. It would have cost, but it wouldn't be outrageous.
So what would have happened to 13th check then?
Well, the 13th check would still have been paid, and so the trick would have been, you can't take the 27 million and make the COLA. We could only take 11 million, if my memory,
surplus.
right. Because you still have to pay the 13th check benefit to all those people who deserve to get it and continue to get it. And so you have to do the math to make the pool of money available, and we didn't even have 27 million then, you do now, but whatever we had, the pool would have been, had to be sufficient to pay the existing 13th check as well as provide for the 1.5% COLA.
And then there were contributions from the employees?
Yeah, I believe we had discussed a small increase in contribution on both parts. I mean, if you look at normal cost, total normal cost, and you have a chart that will tell you what total normal cost is. That is the combination of, in my chart, it runs from 1990, 20.15 up to 2015, 21.11. But for the most of all those years, it's roughly 18%, 17%. That is a combination of the employer normal cost and the employee contribution. That makes up normal cost. So the total normal cost is a two-piece animal. So if the employees are putting in, based on the actuary's assessment of 6.88, then the remainder is picked up by the employer because the burden for a defined benefit is on the employer, and frankly, it's a regular obligation of the city, a general obligation of the city. If you,
John, just real quick, if I may. So I want to go back to Dan's question on the COLA. So my presumption would be then that basis of the status of the 13th check fund, but the difference between what we were doing there and what you were trying to do in terms of guaranteeing that 1 to 1.5%, 3% plan, that then became a mandate of the actuarial computation, and all of a sudden you're in this unfunded liability status.
Well, we had enough to fund, at least to pre-fund the amount, and with interest, the assumed interest, at least 1% or 1.5%. We were gonna be a little bit short, but not too bad. But the public discussion about it was an interesting exercise, in that during that period, nobody really wanted to do a COLA. They'd rather want to do away with the pension versus do away with the COLA. It was the same period where you had a 2-to-1 match, and there was considerable public outcry with regard to 2-to-1 match on the civilian side. So it was a difficult time. I think we tried to do what we could. Our obligation was to defend the plan, to make sure that it was funded the best that we could do, and make sure that we were managing the plan from a proper perspective. Now, in the actuaries report, and you have access to them, but on table 12, normal cost.
Current one?
Yeah, the absolute current one. The table 12 reflects employer normal cost at the 14.23% level. And that would reflect that the employee is contributing 6.68%, as the actuary suggests they are. The normal cost for the city continues to go down. 14.13, 14.03, 13.93, 13.83. So the normal cost of doing service business for the city of Lincoln, for its police and firefighters, the city's percent goes down for the next 5 years. And the problem still remains the elephant, which is the UAL. So taking that apart, I kind of disagree with the actuary, and in my 30+ years of, maybe 40+ years of being around the city and actuaries and various actuaries and testifying in court, I can tell you that their work is extremely professional, but I have yet to ever see their guesstimate be correct. It's a probability, it's math, they do great work, but you can't say this is the answer. So I would suggest to you that their projection here is low, that the city's normal cost will go down further than they're showing you. And the reason I say that is 88% of the current employees are in Plan A. They contribute 8% of their salary, and they're not going to stop contributing until the day they walk out or the day they drop. So they're going to contribute the full 8%. We only have 6 people left on the 7% that aren't contributing anything. And they're 62.3 years of age on average. So I think within the next year or two, you could guess that they're probably going to retire. And they'll be replaced by 8%ers, contributing more than, because these guys are doing zero.
Well, the average right now is
6.68.
6.68.
And they're projecting that it will go somewhere to 7.3 or 7.4 over the next 5 years. And I think it'll be more like 7.5 or 7.6. And so
So they could be off a tenth or two.
yeah, and I would suggest then that if they're off a tenth, that bottom number for the employer would be 13.73% normal cost. So the normal cost isn't your issue. The language of the normal cost wasn't your issue. The current service ought to be paid by the people who get the service. It shouldn't be pushed on to the next generation or the next decade. So paying normal cost is the issue. And I think you're bound to be in a position to recognize that as we go, and I'll have a couple recommendations for you in a couple minutes. I'm about out of gas, so I'm about to finish up. But I can tell you that I'm surprised I haven't coughed. I bet I've had bronchitis for 2 weeks. But you have about 63 people left on Plan B. and their age is average age is over 50. And like it or not, there's a divergence between police and fire, and I know you won't believe it, but there is. Firefighters tend to stay longer, police officers tend to leave earlier. It's just the nature of the pension systems and has for decades. And so I would expect those police members who are entering on Plan B, who are in their early 50s, to start leaving as well. They don't have a drop, so if they can go and get another employment which would cover Social Security, they'll do that. And you'll see people in that group leave. So I would suggest that normal cost will continue to go. A decade from now, I would suggest to you that we'll be at 8% contribution, and that normal cost piece will be down to almost 13% or even 12%. So as I said before, normal cost is not the issue, and it isn't a crisis. It never was a crisis. Getting to the point where we got the right contributions, that meant a lot. And so I think we're in a position to at least recognize the stability of that. If I could revisit the 13th check for a moment. We paid out, according to Table 3, page 14 of the actual report, $553,551 on the 13th check. The plan has $27 million. It's funded to an infinite level. The formula has done more than it could have done, more than I expected it would do, but it hasn't done enough to buy a COLA. I mean, every year that went by, the COLA got more expensive. It continues to get more expensive. There is not sufficient money. And from my point of view, there'll never be sufficient money to buy a COLA out of that pool. So you're left with whether or not you leave the pool where it is, and just simple math would tell you that you have about a 54-year payout if you do nothing to the pool and it doesn't grow. But with the existing formula, it will continue to grow. And so from a general point of view, it seems like to me that you can make a concerted effort between the city, and as part of your recommendations could be that since it's been since the 1994, I think, since we went to $750 base, that you could, part of the discussion, increase the base, work with the union both unions to work together to increase the base, and at the same time adjust the formula so that the funds either no longer go in or that it doesn't continue to build at the rate it's building. You could probably get some concurrence if you're doing both. Like I said, I have no vision of the future that would show me that you have any possibility for a COLA, a real COLA, particularly one that would be market for police officers and firefighters are generally a 3% COLA, and it's the CPI, and it goes every year. Well, you have a 13th check, roughly paying out a little over $1,000 to people who retire, and their pensions are fixed for the rest of their lives. So increasing that amount, there's sufficient funds to increase that amount, and there's also a possibility for you to tweak the formula so that either the money doesn't go in or as fast, or it doesn't earn the interest that the rest of the fund is earning. So you have the capability of recommending that as a part of your proposal. I would also suggest to you that that if you were to tweak the 13th check and adjust the formula, you may be able to recover the unexpected increase in normal cost. I mean, I was flabbergasted when I read it that after 22 years, you have an actuary that now believes that the interest rate ought to be different than it was the last 22 years, and that somehow changing it from 7.5 down to 7.4 cost you $12 million in UAL.
6.4.
or 6.4, or 6.75 to 6.4. That somehow got you $12 million UAL. I think if you tweak the formula, you may be able to recover the $12 million in terms of that language, particularly if you tweak the language working with the union to the extent that you don't have the interest going into the pool. Even if the pool's set like it would today, you could pay it for 54 years, or roughly 54 years. And you could revisit this and.
When you say the interest going into the pool, you mean
The return.
the excess?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, he's saying the COLA earns no interest.
yeah, you do both. Right now, it earns interest and you have, you put money
Okay,
that
so
goes
you
in.
mean both?
Right. But you
So
would have,
take the earnings out of the COLA pool and put them into the primary pension fund? Is that what
well,
you're
in
saying?
theory, you do that because the pool is considered separate. Yeah. Yeah. And so that is one method of probably recouping the 12 million UAL, because that's a guesstimate number too. I mean, that's a,
Well, we've had the conversation before. You can make the number whatever you want it to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Just change your
and
assumptions and get something
after,
different.
after 22 years, I was flabbergasted that this is the year that he decided to make the change. I mean, I know these people and they're very nice people, but, you know, to go to the extreme to say, okay, now's the time, we're gonna change that number. Seems odd to me.
Kick them when
Yeah, it seemed odd to me that would happen.
Well, it's
So-
a different actuary, so it's,
Well, they're the same people. Didn't she work for Milliman before?
She did,
Yeah. And I know Pat. Pat's a very nice lady. She does a good job. I don't have anything against her and her work or her company. But, you know, along the years of my administration, there would be times when an actuary would say, boy, I think we're wrong on that number. And I'd go, we better sit and talk about this because you've been doing that for 10 years before we jump off the cliff and make a change. And so I think that you could tweak that to be a reasonable change. In addition, I think if you put your recommendation that you continue to do normal cost and you plan for the continued amount of UAL, that you'll eventually win the battle. Now, UAL is calculated over a 25 or 30-year period, so you're not going to win the battle tomorrow, but you will at least stabilize the funding. And if you look at the last contributions from 2012 and current, the projections from on normal cost from the actuary table 12 would show you that normal cost contribution by the employer is, plus administrative expenses, is $6,475,000, $6,623,000, $6,775,000, $6,929,000, $7,000,008. It's incremental. It's the rate of the inflation of wages. It's not dramatically inflated by some outside number.
but say again, please, what your thoughts are about the coincidental unfunded liability. You're
Well,
saying-
you have to come up with a plan, and the plan usually is by the actuary to say, okay, we're gonna take this number and we're gonna reduce it based on some math, that so much of that UAL will be,
It's amortized.
right, over a period. Much like making the minimum payment on your credit card. If you make the minimum payment on your credit card, you'll never pay it off. I mean, but you'll pay a lot of interest. So you need a plan that would recognize that you need to add an additional amount to at least target the UAL. So there are two pieces here. You address what you already have done as a city in contributions, the normal costs by mandate, and then you add a targeted amount to attack the UAL. If earnings, and nobody thought we'd have another 2008, and nobody thought that 2015 and 16 would be so rotten either, but if you do have a stabilization of interest and even interest greater than an assumption, then you will reduce the UAL. I mean, that's just the way it works.
But
So,
do you have an opinion about whether the we should be funding the UAL
Yeah,
payment as amortized?
well, I think
You're
whether
saying that
you,
we should target an amount.
well,
How should we calculate that amount?
well, the question is how much money is available. I mean, I had this discussion,
Well,
I had this.
There's no money available.
Well, and I'm going to reinforce that. I had a couple discussions with a couple mayors, and I said, you know, if you don't address normal cost, at some point, you won't have a parks department.
Right.
And so
I'm
that-
actually asking about the unfunded liability. Let's say that, you know, the city pays the normal cost, and we're left with the amortized payment towards the unfunded liability. And the amortization being that if we make those payments, it'll be fully paid over whatever the amortized period of time is. And if we don't make those payments in full, maybe we'll get lucky, maybe we'll get unlucky, but, I mean, there's a calculation.
Right. Well, and you were doing that. If you look at the numbers in the last couple of years, the normal cost was going to be somewhere in the 13, 14 range, and you put in 18 or 19%. So you put in both normal cost and you put in UAL. I mean, you actually did that the last couple of years.
I thought I heard you suggest that if we would only pay the normal cost, that the unfunded liability would take care of itself.
Oh, absolutely not. No, that'll never happen.
All right, well, so,
No, you need-
I don't think it will, but I want to make sure
No,
I
I-
understood what you were saying. So-
No,
I was understanding the same thing.
So.
I
I'm wondering-
apologize for making the
No, I probably
confusion.
misheard you, but,
The theory is that you need to pay normal cost to what you are statutorily. And then you need to make sure that you're following a plan. Now, the plan is the actuary's plan. And if you follow the plan on unfunded liability, you'll get to the golden goose at some point.
okay.
And that is true. But if looking at the last couple of years of contributions, you have done normal cost and you did an amount greater than normal cost. The city was already doing that starting, I think, 14 and 15, for sure, and maybe even the year before. I don't know if that's the recommended, I don't have the inside scoop anymore. I'm not part of those conversations, but clearly the long-term goal would to get back to normal. I've read hundreds of actuaries' reports and discussed with numerous actuaries, both this pension and other pensions in regard to getting prepared for testimony, including, as a side note, San Jose, California. On behalf of the police union there, I talked to the legislature on their pension when they were in horrible shape. Of course, we don't have a 90% pension and with a 3% COLA, so there's apples to oranges in discussion. But in reading all those, plans vary in the amount of contribution. And the only way that technically, there's two things that could happen that you have to pay your bill, all of your bill. One thing that happens if you pay your entire bill is if for one reason or another, we have some kind of tragedy and the police department and fire department are gone. I would suggest to you if that happens, then we all have bigger problems than unfunded liability. But the second part is if you changed from a defined benefit to a defined contribution, you still owe $200 million. The unfunded liability didn't go away. The only thing that went away was normal cost, and then you're going to have to pay some other benefit and maybe even Social Security. So there's no really way to get around what you have here. I think I've already demonstrated that the employees are going to contribute more as the time goes along because they'll be closer to the 8%. The employer normal cost is going to be reduced. But the reduction ought to be placed toward the UAL. And so the contribution shouldn't be lowered. It should be staying at the level necessary to start paying down a UAL. And so when I read it, I read the actuary's report, I looked at the information, I didn't see a huge crisis. I didn't see anything that would cause me to believe that we ought to be jumping off a cliff or anything. There are trends over time, things go up and down. These are funded for an employee's entire career, from the day they start to the day they end. And as I said earlier, there's a perception that it's just a pension, and there aren't people behind the pension. But if you looked at the last weekend in Prince William County, Virginia, a police officer was murdered on the very first day of work. Whether it's your very first day of work or if it's your very last day of work, this pension pays for your family and your security, and this is the only thing that is their safety net. So when you're making your recommendations and you're chewing over what to decide and what to do, it's not just a matter of, well, we don't have any money. It's a matter of, this is the only thing that protects them. There isn't anything else. There's no Social Security. There's no other thing. This is their system. And so I think I covered everything. I still have a voice. Slightly longer than 45 minutes. I apologize.
That's okay.
I'd be glad to answer any other questions you have about the history or about what my thoughts are, or
Do we have further questions?
Dan has done some analysis of the returns on investments being significantly lower than the benchmark. Do you have any perspective on that? Is that something that you got some concern about? Obviously, had we reached the benchmarks, there would be a lot more money in the pool.
well, there's two factors there. Had we not, rated the pool, when it was 120 or 130% funded, and even though we had a dip in return, we would have still been near the 90 to 100%. And really, people don't get all that nervous until you're down to 80 or below. But the return on investment grew substantially as the portfolio grew, and it widened in equities from the late 90s. And then we had an immediate crisis in 2001, which really set back the equities. And there was a period where we had 3-year smoothing, and then we went to 5-year smoothing to try to iron out what was perceived to be a long-term investment. I mean, you're not making a 1-year investment, you're making a long-term investment. So you look theoretically at the history of returns and you try to judge off the history of returns, and that's what the plan was doing, both with the assumption and with its investment. I have no input or have no idea what the plan does or has done for the last 5 years with regard to its funding or who does the investments. I just don't know, Don. But when we had it, there were periods where we did very well, and there were periods where, despite our best efforts, the economy didn't do as well as we had hoped.
But the issue was with respect to the benchmark. Obviously, the benchmark goes up and down along with the market return.
Right. The benchmark on your returns on the portfolio, is that you're talking about?
Watershed publishes a report, and they show the return of the plan, and they show return of the stated benchmark that's been adopted by the committee that is the fiduciary of the plan. And there's a gap between those two, and that gap, according to the watershed report, has averaged over 2% a year for long periods of time.
Yeah, I have not seen that, and for at least the last 5 or 6 years, I have no idea what they're doing or haven't seen it. And if there were periods in the late 90s, and
This doesn't go back to the 90s.
even if you were in the early 2000s, there was a long period of time for us to transition to anything that looked like a normal portfolio. But once we got that normal portfolio, the advice was pretty standard, I thought. I mean, we didn't jump off we had some early on.
Not jumping off any cliff.
No, I know
I'd say
that.
it's consistently showed a 2%
Right.
performance
And-
over multiple periods.
Well, and I that would concern me, and that would concern the kind of advice I'd be getting. I mean, clearly. I mean, I don't know who your person is now, because it's different than when I was here, but I would be concerned about the advice, and I'd be concerned about the investment, but I don't know what they are. And so it's hard for me to be critical, Dan, of...
I'm not trying to ask you to be critical.
No, I'm just saying, I just don't know that answer. I'm not familiar with the return, so.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Kreib?
I'm sorry if I kept you from the Bernie Sanders rally.
You kept us from a long line. You probably did us a favor. Thank you very much for being here today and for your presentation. It's very useful.
Thank you.
Thank